Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. I'm Martyn Warwick and we're here reporting from the ETSI NFV ISG. Quite a mouthful. It's about the standardization of network functions virtualization. Service providers are telling manufacturers and vendors that when it comes to NFV, interoperability is absolutely paramount. However, the history of de facto proprietary standards in our industry tells us that genuine openness is hard to achieve. So, will it be any different this time round?
Well, we're certainly committed to making it different. HP has a culture and a DNA around openness and open standards. We certainly support open standards in a wide variety of our products. And our goal as a leader in the industry is to provide an open environment and choice for the customers. So I think that a combination of companies like ourselves, as well as the many startups that are emerging in this space who really want to participate, as long as we work together to offer interoperability to each other, I think it will continue. And certainly HP is committed to that. And I know what I've talked to, when I've talked to the carriers, they're also very committed to that. So they will make choices more towards an open environment and folks who provide them choice than a proprietary environment and one that's closed.
It's not obvious to me that we can achieve it readily openness in the way that we envisaged in the original white paper. Mm-hmm. That's not, the industry itself is a dynamic you don't control. And I think that the key to it is to have the enablers for it, but also energize those. So in the architectural framework that we published, there are a number of interfaces that are called out in that. And the amount of work that's gone in to define the requirements for those interfaces has been incredibly intense. And some of the world's best engineering expertise have been applied to those to actually set the requirements. But actually to implement software that actually defines those interfaces is the key to openness, because in the architectural framework we've outlined a number of domains that map to future products from the vendors. And in the old world, the whole framework would have been provided to you by one extremely capable vendor. Yeah. No doubt at all that the telecoms world has been built on that model very successfully. But in the new world, the world where consumption of media and content and business services over smart devices, that isn't the world that we had 20 years ago. It's a very different world.
Absolutely.
And the ambition that I have is that we are able to engineer networks that can self-adapt, be automated in ability to respond to the changes of the marketplace. That means you can't do that by specification and diktat. So what we're trying to do is to say, okay, these interfaces are the ones that will enable you to build networks that are flexible and software enabled in the way that we envisaged in the original white paper. But getting those interfaces specified is the key to progress. There's two approaches for that. One is to actually try and specify them. And in the telco world, that has proven to be a very long-winded process. And we will not do that within the ISG except to the level necessary to achieve interoperability. So we look to the open source dynamic to also point the way. So in the software world, open source development is absolutely a well understood methodology, software development methodology. So the challenge actually is to apply software development methodologies to network engineering. And that's the discipline that we are all learning how to do. And in my mind, prototyping those interfaces is probably the way to move forward. Prototyping them not within a proprietary environment, but an environment which allows vendors to work together. One end of an interface and another at the other end of the interface, and then prove that the interface is interoperable through open source software development, but with the requirements and the parameters that get passed across those interfaces being in some way specified here in the ISG.
It's emphasized all the time that if NFV is going to be the global success everybody wants it to be, it's going to have to be open. Mm-hmm. But the reality, as we all know from history in this game, is that telecommunications and the IT industry is by its nature proprietary. we have seen in the past, maybe mobility has been slightly different to that, but go back to fixed line and the IT industry in itself, very much a case of emerging de facto standards that happen all the time. How are we going to avoid that this time around?
Well, I think that there is first of all, make a point of this. If you look at the evolution of the networking IT industry has been on private or particular enhancement of open platforms. You think that, for example, when it comes to the, let's say in the database arena, you have Oracle that is extremely successful, but they're using SQL. That is an open standard. It's an open technology. And elsewhere you look is about the differentiation of a company that has been successful on top of an open substrate. The clue here, I guess, is precisely to identify which is the open substrate, and to define clearly which is the limits between the open substrate and the proprietary differentiation that will allow a company to make money and to have success.
Are we going to be able to avoid that trap of locking people into a particular proprietariness again?
I actually think we will. And the reason why I think that is, and by the way, standards aren't necessarily a bad thing. When you look at mobile, which I mentioned just a minute ago, 3GPP has actually done great things to allow for basically the globalization of mobility. And so it's not always a negative. That said, as we look to transform these network infrastructures, we have to look to bodies such as ETSI and a driving force for the carrier community or the global service provider community to drive adoption or change in those standards. Because the reason why we wind up with these closed, locked-in systems is people build monoliths. And they built monoliths based on proprietary platforms. And what people are looking at NFV to do is decouple all of that, not just a piece of it. We actually want to get atomic with these functions. So when I've got a serving gateway or packet gateway that's terminating a GTP session from a subscriber handset, I want to be able to create the termination and the NAT function separately as just a very small example of what I'd like to do. And that's actually what the carriers are telling us, is they would like to see atomic functions to be totally broken apart and hosted on COTS. And that way they can go not just up into the cloud, but they can actually push the tentacles of their network farther and farther to the edge so they can start doing more creative things closer to the edge of their networks as well.
I think we are moving into a much more open world than historically we've been in the networking space. And just the fact that we can take a piece of hardware from vendor A and a piece of software from vendor B, and we've got a broad choice of vendors in both the hardware and software space, and just put the two together and deliver a network function based on that. I mean, that is a remarkable change that's happened. Obviously not remarkable in the context of the IT world that's been doing this for years, but in the networking space, this is new stuff and revolutionary stuff, and it's about time probably that it's happened. So I think there's clearly an ability to create openness with a judicious mix of de facto standards, most of which, by the way, are coming out of the open source world.
Historically, if you looked at open source, you would see some proprietary player coming to market with an operating system, call it Microsoft, a database, call it Oracle, and so on and so forth. And N number of years later, you would see an open source, lower cost alternative that would show up, where N was typically 5, 7, 10 years after the original innovation. And in this era, what we call the mobile cloud era, we are seeing innovation start with open source and proprietary follow. Think of Apache Hadoop and the big data movement. It's driven by this open source project called Apache Hadoop. Cloud orchestration has been driven by CloudStack, OpenStack. These are the drivers of innovation, and now you have proprietary players that are coming around and saying, how do I build on top of that open core and add value, provide services, provide support? And I believe that thus the role going forward will be radically different of open source in the community.
I think the network industry is really coming around to the idea that you get leverage, you get faster time to market with these open source projects. So whether it be here at the NFV or at Open Daylight, or at OpenStack. All of these are new, but they're really gaining a lot of momentum in the last couple years, and I think that'll allow the community to collaborate, to open up, and to prevent the vendor lock-in, which was, after all, one of the very earliest goals in the NFV white paper. And so I think everybody's working towards that.
Don McCulloch, as usual, thank you very much.